This is part one of a four-part video series in which we will construct the Lego Robot Educator driving base. Lego provides a graphic construction booklet in both the core education set and in the software that goes along with the Lego Mindstorms. These videos supplement those instructions by providing a detailed description of each part and how it goes into the robot assembly. In the description area below, you will find a link to a file which includes a text listing of each step and the parts needed for that step. So let's get started. We start our driving base construction by making the right motor assembly. For step one, we have two parts, one of the large motors and a 3M peg with friction. For the large motor, we want to orient it so that the plug for the cable is on the left and the round driving head is on the right near the bottom. And then we're going to be putting in the peg into the 3M connection that sits above the drive head and a little bit to the left, so the top one. Now on that 3M connection there is a front hole, a center cross, and a back hole, and we will be putting the peg into the front hole. Now the peg is a 3M peg. It has 1M on one side and 2M on the other side. There's a ridge that separates that. And we're going to take that short 1M side and put it into the front hole in that 3M connector that is on the top of our motor. So we will have 2M sticking out towards us. Now for step two, we only have one piece to add. It is an angular beam that is 3 by 7. We want to orient that piece so that the 7 space side is going horizontally and the 3 space side is coming down towards the bottom right. And then we will be putting this onto the peg that we just inserted, and it will go into the 3rd space from the left on the long side. And we will still have some pegs sticking out because remember that was 2 M's that was inserted into that hole there. And the angular beam, the end of it, should line up exactly with the back of that connector that's on the top of the motor. It's a little wobbly right now, but don't worry, we will be correcting that in a step coming up. Step 3 has 3 pieces, a 4M axle, a 2M axle extension, and 1 friction cross axle connector. We'll start out by taking the 4M axle and the 2M extension piece and connecting them together. Just push the axle into the axle extender until it cannot go any further. We will take the unit we just made and insert it into the large motor assembly. I'll take the large motor assembly and orient it so that the connector plug is facing towards me and the angular beam that we added is towards the right. And we'll take this little assembly with the axle and it's going to go into that top connector on the front of the motor into the back hole. So when you put that in, you'll have to twist it a little bit so that the axle will line up with the cross hole on the angular beam, and just push it all the way through until the axle extender bumps up against the 3M connector that's on the top of the motor. And so you should have your axle extender sitting on the left at the back of that connector on the motor. And then on the right, the angular beam is coming to the front. There is, the axle is sticking out at the left end of the angular beam. There's an empty space, and then there is a friction connector next. Now we still have our little friction cross axle connector. This is the kind of peg that has a cross axle, a cross on one end, and a friction peg on the other. And we'll take the cross axle end and we'll stick it into the end of the angular beam, the three side, where there's a cross at that end, and just push that in until it goes all the way in there. For step 4, we have one peg with friction, that's the short one, and we have two 3M pegs with friction, those are the longer ones. I have the large motor oriented in front of me so that the plug is to the left, the driving head is on the bottom right, the angular beam that we added is on top there, facing down to the right, and I can feel the 3 pegs sticking up. Now I'm going to take one of the long 3M pegs with friction, and I'm going to take the longer side this time, and I'm going to put it right in the corner hole of that angular beam and push it all the way through. So there should be part of that peg will be sticking out on the top and part is on the bottom. Then I'm going to take my second 3M beam. Again, I'm going to put the long side in. I'm going to put it directly to the left of the peg we just inserted, and again push that all the way through. And then I'm going to continue and take the short connector peg and put that to the left of that last peg that we put in. So now when we look at our angular beam, if we start on the left, we have an axle, a cross sticking up, an empty hole, a friction peg, an empty hole, then 3 friction pegs in a row up to the corner, and then coming down the angle there's an empty hole, and then at the very end there is another friction peg sticking out. In step 5, we have 2 of the small pegs with friction, and we have a angle beam that is 3 by 5 with a 90-degree angle. And we want to orient that angle beam so that the long side is vertical, the short side is horizontal, and the short side is at the top and facing toward the right. So short side at the right, top, and the long 5 side is vertically pointing to you. We'll take one of the connector pegs and put it in that bottom hole of the 5 side, then skip a hole and put the other connector peg in. Now we'll still keep this angle beam oriented in this direction, and I still have my large motor so that the plug is on the left and the drive head is on the right, and all my little pegs on the angular beam are sticking up. And the right angle, the 90-degree beam, is going to connect onto what we have so far by taking the 3 holes on the top of that beam and putting them on the 3 pegs that are in the row on the angular beam. So the end hole on the top of the 3 side, it will go on the corner of the long angular beam. So all 3 spaces will have a hole, and then the long leg of that 3 by 5 90-degree beam will come and it will be right in the middle of the drive head. You can feel it coming right in the middle of the drive head. In step 6 we have one part to add, and that is the 8M axle with end stop. I still have the motor oriented, so the plug is on the left and the drive head is on the right, and all of the angular beams that we added are on top with all of their connections. You can still feel those. That is considered the outside of the motor. So I'm going to take my axle with the end stop and I'm going to insert it into the center of the drive head from the inside to the outside. Just make sure you get it pushed all the way through. And that's step 6. In step 7, we again only have one part, and that is a 3M beam. Orient the 3M beam so it is vertical. The center hole of that beam is going to go over the axle that is sticking up, and then the top and bottom hole will fit onto the pegs that are on either side of the axle. And just kind of wiggle it around until it fits on there, and make sure you've got it tightly fit against the L-beam that's underneath there. In step 8, we have 3 pieces to add. We have one of the little friction cross axle connectors. We have an angular beam that has 4 on each side. There's a center hole, and then on either side there are 2 holes, and at the ends there are the crosses for axle connectors. And then we have one 4M axle with an end stop. We'll start by adding the little friction cross axle connector. It has a cross end and a round end, and we're going to take the round end and put it into the 3x7 angular beam that's already on our construction. Now that angular beam is, the little 3 end is hanging down on the right, and there's a peg in the end hole, and then there's an empty hole, and that's the hole that we're going to put the little friction cross axle connector in. So put the round end in and get that seated. Kind of keep track of where that is, because that friction peg is going to be what we connect the 4x4 angular beam to. So the 4x4 angular beam, you'll have it oriented so that it is like a V. The point of it is facing towards you. And then add it to the construction so that that cross axle peg we just added will go into the end hole, and then the peg that's on the end of the 3x7 angular beam goes into the next hole. That should make a good tight connection there. And then our last piece to add, which is the 4M axle with the end stop, we'll again insert this peg from the inside of the construction to the outside, and it is going to go in the other end of the 4x4 angular beam. So now you should have an axle that is sticking out at the very end of the construction on the end of that 4x4 angular beam, and there is an axle sticking out of the center of the drive head. And there are also a couple of other pegs that are sitting out on the top of the drive motor facing towards the right. And now we'll just put this construction aside for a moment. In steps 9 through 13, we will work on the center assembly. Step 9 has 3 pieces. There's a beam frame that is 5x7, and then 2 of the pegs with friction. Orient the beam frame so the short ends are horizontal and the long sides are vertical. And then put it on its edge, and you will see that on the side there are 3 holes, and I'm working on the right side, and we're going to put a connector peg in the bottom hole and in the top hole. So on the right side of the beam frame, the 2 connector pegs are inserted with an empty hole in between. In step 10, we will add 2 of our friction cross-axle connectors. I've got the beam frame flat on the table now, and the connector pegs we just added are off to the right. And for these friction cross-axle connectors, we'll take the round end, and working on the left top side of the beam frame, where there are 4 holes, we'll put one of the round ends of the first peg in the top hole and the other one in the bottom hole. So we have a peg in the top and a peg in the bottom with their cross axles sticking up. In step 11, we will add 2 cross blocks. These are the 90-degree cross blocks. And on these cross blocks there is one round hole, and at 90 degrees to that there is a cross axle hole, the kind with a plus in it. And we're going to take that plus end and put it on each of those axle friction pegs that we just added on the left side. Just kind of twist it around till you can find that axle, and then turn it so that the angle of the new piece is flush with the top or the bottom of the beam frame. Now we're ready to attach the center assembly to the right motor. We'll start by taking our center assembly, turning it 90 degrees and standing it up so it's standing up on the long end that also has the 2 cross blocks attached to it, and on the top are 2 of the friction pegs. Now where this will attach to the right motor is on the right side near the bottom, where there will be 2 holes in alignment, one from the beam frame and one from the cross block. There's 2 holes right there in alignment. So bring in your right motor, and on the right motor, where those 2 holes are going to go, is on the top near the front above the drive head. There are 2 pegs sticking out, and those 2 pegs will connect with those 2 holes that we just talked about. So bring that in and push it until they connect. So you've got the right motor with the axle sticking out to the right, and now our beam frame is attached to the left of that, which will be the center of our robot, with 2 connector pegs sticking up on the top. Step 13, which is the last step for the center assembly, is to add one part, which is a 3M axle. This axle will be attached to the right motor, and it will go into the axle extender. Now the axle extender is sticking out on the left, and it's closest to the back kind of large section to the motor is where that axle extender is. And we'll just take that 3M axle and stick it into the axle extender so that you have about 2M of axle sticking out to the left now. This is the end of part 1. We'll put this assembly aside while we build the left motor assembly.